Imagine this, 250 paratroopers cut off in a valley outside coast. Enemy mortars walked closer with every round, machine guns raked the riverbed, and radios crackled with the last of their ammo count. Command had already drafted the casualty list. Helicopters were warned it was suicide to enter. But on that day, when doctrine said, "Hold," one Black Hawk pilot refused to turn back. Her name was Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell. 27 years old, barely 5'5", and often dismissed as the girl who flew too careful. But careful was what kept crews alive in Afghanistan's thin mountain air. Careful was why she knew every ridgeline, every crosswind, every ambush alley by heart. And when 250 paratroopers were about to be swallowed alive, careful wasn't timidity. It was courage measured down to the inch of rotor clearance. This is the story of the day Sarah Mitchell broke formation, drove her Black Hawk straight through fire that should have shredded her, and carved a way home for every soldier trapped. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love seeing our Army family spread across the world. The morning began the same way. Every morning did at FOB Salerno, dust clouds curling off the ground before the sun had even burned the horizon, generators humming, and the high-pitched whine of turbines as crews ran through their checks. Mechanics leaned into engine bays, crew chiefs pulled at tie-downs, and pilots walked the line with checklists tucked under their arms. For most, it was routine. For Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell, it was ritual. She touched each skid, brushed each rotor blade, and made sure her crew saw her do it. It wasn't superstition, it was discipline. A Black Hawk had to trust its pilot, and she believed that meant knowing every bolt and seam by heart. But this morning, one thing was different. The mission board. Pinned under plexiglass, written in heavy black marker across one line of operations, were the words, "No pilot ever wanted to see, do not launch." Ambush zone, too hot. Mitchell stopped when her eyes found it. Her chest tightened. The mission tag wasn't anonymous, it carried a name. 2nd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. She knew those men. 2 weeks earlier, she had flown them into a ridgeline insertion, joking about Chow Hall coffee while they slapped her shoulder on the way out the door. Paratroopers were tough, but they had a way of making a pilot feel like family. And now their situation reports, pinned to the bottom of the board, repeated a single word again and again. Overrun. Mitchell's eyes traced the rest. Radio intercepts indicated a full company-sized ambush. Mortars. PKM machine guns. RPG nests dug into high rock. Every approach in and out was covered. The order had already come down from higher command, no rotary wing movement until fixed wing cleared the ridgelines. But fixed wing was 30 minutes out. The paratroopers didn't have 30 minutes. Inside the briefing room, a cluster of officers bent over maps. The walls hummed with air conditioning that never seemed to work right. Radios hissed static in the background. Mitchell broke the silence. "If we wait," she said evenly, "we'll be flying in for body bags." The words hung like smoke. No one moved. Finally, her company commander looked up, jaw tight. "You're not cleared to launch." "That's final." Mitchell held his gaze. For a moment, she wanted to argue. To point at the names on the board. To remind him those were men they had flown, men who counted on helicopters to be their lifeline. Instead, she nodded, quiet, controlled. Then she turned and walked out. The corridor was dim, dust motes caught in shafts of weak light through the windows. Every step she took echoed against the concrete. She could already hear her bird outside, blades secured, waiting. Black Hawk tail, number 31. The crew was nearby, leaning against sandbags. Specialist O'Hara, her door gunner, raised an eyebrow when he saw her expression. "Ma'am, what's the word?" Mitchell didn't answer right away. She ran a hand along the Black Hawk's nose, felt the sun-warmed skin of the fuselage under her palm. Machines carried memory. They remembered who treated them right. Behind her, her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Keller, shifted uneasily. "Orders are scrubbed, right?" he asked. Mitchell looked up, eyes narrowing on the sky where tracer fire already faintly marked the distant ridgelines. You could almost hear the valley breathing war. "Orders are scrubbed," she confirmed. Then softer, "But if we wait, they're done." Keller opened his mouth, then closed it again. He'd flown with her long enough to recognize that tone. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't impulse. It was calculation. Word spread quickly around the line. Other pilots, other crews, watched her with sidelong glances. Some shook their heads. Others avoided looking at all. Everyone knew the truth. Whoever went into that valley was flying into a meat grinder. Inside the ops tent, chatter grew tense. Reports filtered in faster now. The paratroopers' net was alive with clipped, urgent voices, ammo counts, casualties. Coordinates rattled off in breathless bursts. And then, silence on one squad's frequency. Mitchell listened from the doorway. She didn't need to hear more. Her commander barked another reminder. "No launches. That's an order." "We wait for F-116s." Mitchell turned away. The walk back to her helicopter felt like the longest of her career. Every step was a decision tightening in her chest. She thought of the faces of the paratroopers she'd flown before. Young men with nervous grins. Veterans with steady eyes. All of them had trusted that when they called for a bird, someone would come. Her boots crunched on gravel as she reached tail number 31. She laid her hand on the metal again, and in that quiet, dusty morning she decided. If command wouldn't send her in, she would go anyway, because careful didn't mean cautious. Careful meant she had spent years learning every downdraft, every hidden fold of ground, every trick of survival in those mountains. Careful meant she could fly that bird into fire and still bring men home. Keller stepped closer, searching her face. "We're doing this, aren't we?" Mitchell strapped on her helmet. "We're doing this." The crew said nothing more. They simply moved to their stations, as if the Black Hawk itself had whispered the same decision into their ears. On the horizon, the sun broke free, painting the valley in harsh gold. And in the shadows of that light, Sarah Mitchell climbed into her cockpit, flipped switches with steady hands, and prepared to take the first step into a mission no one believed was survivable. The mission that would define her name. She had no escort, Apaches. No planned suppression fire. No comforting roar of a gunship clearing her path. Just her UH-60 Blackhawk, 2 door gunners with M240s, and a crew chief who had seen more than one helicopter not make it back. He leaned close as Mitchell strapped into her seat. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed what he already knew. "Ma'am, are we really doing this?" Mitchell slid her visor down, fingers flipping switches with the muscle memory of 1,000 hours. "We're not flying into fire," she said. Her tone was flat, matter-of-fact. "We're flying to them." The turbine spooled, rotors thundered, and the bird lifted in a plume of dust that swallowed the ground crew. For a heartbeat, the world was muffled inside her helmet. The smell of hot oil and jet fuel, the vibration of power building beneath her. Then the headset snapped alive. 2-4, you are not cleared to launch. Confirm hold position. Mitchell pressed the transmit. Negative. 2-4 is en route. There was silence. Then the command net erupted in overlapping voices. Anger, disbelief, demands to return. Mitchell killed the channel with a flick of her thumb. The only voices she needed to hear were her crew and the men dying in that valley. Into the ambush. The mountains closed around them fast, jagged ridges rising like jaws. The closer they got, the more the radios bled panic. Short bursts, clipped words. Rounds low. "We're cut off. Request immediate support." Then the valley mouth bloomed with tracer fire. It looked alive, green and red streaks climbing the air, converging on her Blackhawk, as if the entire horizon had turned into a net of fire. RPG contrails hissed upward, curling like claws. Mitchell shoved the cyclic left, throwing the Hawk sideways. The fuselage groaned, blades screamed, and dust stormed through the cabin. Soldiers in the back gripped the floor netting, wide-eyed. 2-4, you're in a hornet's nest, break off, the radio order barked. But she didn't break off, she dropped lower. Lower than doctrine, lower than sanity. Branches slapped the fuselage, rotor wash carved furrows in dirt. But she knew something the men on the radio didn't. Mortars couldn't adjust fast enough this low, and machine gunners firing down from the ridges couldn't depress their barrels far enough. At 50 feet above the ground, she saw them. 250 paratroopers, pinned in staggered lines against a dry riverbed. Helmets low, rifles barking in ragged rhythm, dust spitting with every impact around them. They were down to their last magazines, and still they fought. Mitchell's voice cut across the met. 2-4 inbound, heads turned, faces lifted through sweat and blood. The sky, which should have been their grave, had just opened with a lifeline. First touchdown, her door gunners opened up, M240s hammering the ridgelines. The thud of brass hitting the floor mixed with the whine of engines straining under her dive. She saw gaps open in the enemy curtain-ripped holes where seconds of survival could exist. Mitchell flared the Hawk and planted it on a strip of rock barely wide enough for skids. Nose high, tail exposed, her aircraft sat with its most vulnerable piece pointed directly at the kill zone. She didn't care. Load them fast, she barked. The paratroopers didn't hesitate. They surged forward, first carrying the wounded, then shoving squad leaders aboard. The cabin filled with the smell of blood and cordite. Every second was borrowed. Mortar shells bracketed closer, their blasts rocking the helicopter. A PKM team shifted for a shot at her tail rotor, the single hit that would mean certain death. Mitchell caught it out of the corner of her eye. She yanked collective, swung the Hawk sideways, and her door gunner unleashed a furious burst. The PKM fell silent, smoke rising from its nest. "Go, go, go," Keller, her crew chief, shouted as he yanked men inside, pushing them against the bulkhead. The Hawk overloaded fast, 24 men crammed into a bird designed for 11. Mitchell's warning panel glowed with stress. She ignored it. "Hold tight," she said, her voice low, steady, meant for herself as much as them. "We'll make it." The turn back. She pulled them out in a shallow climb, riding the tree line, blades inches from splintering against rock. The valley spat fire after her, tracer rounds chasing like angry bees. Her door gunners raked the edges until the paratroopers were clear. Behind her, men gasped, some crying openly, some silent with shock. All alive. But Mitchell didn't turn toward base. She turned back. Second run. The valley greeted her return with fury. The enemy knew now. She was the weak link in their plan. They focused everything on her. RPGs streaked closer, mortars shifted faster, PKM fire thickened like rain. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared. Hydraulic pressure warnings. Over-torque lights. She flew through them like they were whispers. Her crew didn't ask this time if she was serious. They knew. She dropped into the same alley of death, forcing the helicopter down through smoke and dust. A second group of paratroopers broke cover, running low, dragging wounded. She could see the whites of their eyes as they scrambled into the bird. Get them in, Keller shouted. His hands were raw from hauling men like sacks, shoving them into impossible space. Mitchell kept her eyes forward, cyclic steady despite rounds pinging against the fuselage. A bullet spidered across her windshield. Another tore through a gunner's seatbelt. He kept firing. Once more, overloaded. Once more, lift straining. And once more she pulled them out. Third run back at Salerno, her commander was nearly shouting into the net. 2-4, break off now. That is an order. Mitchell didn't even toggle the channel. She couldn't afford the distraction. The third trip was worse. Enemy gunners anticipated her path now. RPGs crossed in X patterns. Mortars were pre-sighted. She came in from a different angle, hugging the ridge, rotor tips inches from stone. At the last second, she rolled, dropped into the kill zone, and set down in a storm of dust. Paratroopers rushed, shoving each other forward, desperate. The cabin filled beyond bursting, men crammed against bulkheads, rifles clattering. Someone screamed as shrapnel tore across a leg. Mitchell's crew chief tied a tourniquet with one hand and shoved the man deeper inside with the other. Another overload. Another impossible takeoff. The Black Hawk clawed into the air, tail dipping, engines howling. Mitchell whispered to herself again. Hold together, just hold together. And the Hawk did. Fourth run. By now, her bird bore scars, punctures along the fuselage. A cracked panel. Warning lights that didn't stop blinking. But there were still paratroopers down there. She went back. The crew said nothing. They simply checked ammo belts, tightened straps, and waited. This time, as she entered the valley, she saw movement enemy fighters trying to flank the survivors, closing in for the kill. Mitchell banked low, her gunners opening fire to cut the line. The paratroopers surged for the landing zone, sprinting through smoke. Last lift, someone shouted as the men piled in, cramming shoulder to shoulder. Mitchell's arms ached from fighting the controls. Sweat poured down her face. She forced the Hawk into the sky, rotor wash flattening grass, skids clipping stone as they climbed. The valley spat rage beneath them, but it was too late. The last call. The radio crackled. A voice, breaking but steady. Last stick aboard. 250 accounted for. 0 left behind. Mitchell exhaled. Her hands shook for the first time all day. 250 men. Every last one. Her crew sat stunned, helmets tilted back, eyes wide. The paratroopers in the cabin clung to each other, some whispering prayers, some just staring at her in disbelief. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Aftermath in the sky. The climb out was quiet, save for the thump of rotors and the groan of metal pushed to its limit. The enemy still fired, but their chance was gone. Mitchell had done what the rulebook said was impossible. She had pulled 250 men from a valley designed to be their tomb. When Salerno's towers finally appeared on the horizon, her crew chief muttered into the intercom, voice thick, "Mom, we brought them all." Mitchell only nodded, eyes fixed forward. She knew the fight with command would come later. The reprimands, the paperwork, the politics. But none of that mattered, because tonight, every one of those paratroopers would walk off that flight line alive. The last lift nearly broke her bird. The valley knew this was the final act. Every gun, every mortar, every RPG shifted its sights toward the one helicopter that had humiliated their ambush plan. An RPG screamed out of the smoke, detonating just short of the tail. Shrapnel peppered the fuselage, sparks showering across the cabin. Warning panels lit like a Christmas tree. "Hydraulics hot," the co-pilot yelled. "Tails hit." Keller, her crew chief, shouted from the back. The Black Hawk shuddered, metal complaining with each vibration. "Abort, ma'am." "We're not going to hold it together." Mitchell's hands clenched on the cyclic, knuckles white under her gloves. Her jaw locked tight. "Not until they're out." The words were steady, ironclad. The impossible load. The landing zone was chaos. Smoke and dust cloaked everything. Wounded soldiers dragged each other forward, stumbling, half carrying, half pushing. Their faces were hollow with exhaustion, streaked with blood and dirt. Some still fired behind them as they ran, covering the last desperate dash. The Hawk's skid slammed onto rock so uneven the bird tilted dangerously. The vibration ran up her spine as bullets thudded into the cabin walls. A round shattered the co-pilot's windshield, spraying glass fragments across his lap. "Hold her steady!" Keller yelled as he yanked another man up the ramp. "We've got more coming." Mitchell's muscles burned as she fought the controls, forcing the Hawk level on ground that wanted to throw it over. Every second stretched into a lifetime. The wounded piled in first, bodies laid across the cabin floor, boots overlapping, helmets clattering. Then came the squad leaders, shoving their men aboard whether there was space or not. The bird filled beyond reason, shoulders pressed against bulkheads, rifles stacked, breath hot and ragged. Soldiers clung to each other in the crush, some screaming orders, some silent with shock. In the cockpit, alarms wailed louder. Transmission temps climbing. Rotor RPM flirting with red. "Engines holding," Keller shouted from the back. "Good," Mitchell whispered. "Hold with me." The ascent. She pulled collective, coaxing the Hawk into a shallow lift. The skid scraped rock, screeching against stone before finally breaking free. The helicopter clawed upward, engines howling, rotors biting at the air. Tracer rounds chased them, green and red fire tearing past windows. One round punched through the side, ricocheting off the floor just inches from a wounded paratrooper's leg. The door gunners raked the ridgelines, barrels glowing, belts running dry. "Suppressing! Suppressing!" they yelled, voices hoarse. The Hawk skimmed the treetops, barely clearing branches. Mortar blasts followed, shock waves rocking the cabin. Soldiers ducked instinctively, arms covering heads as dirt rained through the open doors. Mitchell forced her eyes forward, ignoring the chaos behind her. Every input on the cyclic was precise, deliberate. Her hands were iron, steady against the tremor of a bird that wanted to give up. The ridge loomed closer. One last climb. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on!" The Hawk surged, engines screaming in defiance. Then, at last, the ground fell away behind them. For the first time all day, the valley's guns couldn't reach them. The breathless silence. Inside the cabin, silence fell. Not the silence of peace, but the silence after near-death breathing, heavy and raw, men staring at each other with the wide eyes of those who knew how close they'd come. 250 paratroopers. Every single one alive. Keller sagged against the bulkhead, helmet tipped back, sweat running down his face. "We've got them," he muttered, as if saying it out loud made it real. One of the paratroopers, his uniform torn, blood running down his arm, leaned forward until his eyes met Mitchell's through the cockpit door. He raised a trembling hand in salute. The men around him followed, crammed shoulder to shoulder, packed like cargo, yet finding space to lift their hands in the only gesture they had left. Mitchell didn't look back. She couldn't, not yet. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, fingers locked steady on the controls. The enemy's last card. But the valley wasn't finished. A seeker tone blared in her headset, surface-to-air missile lock. Her blood ran cold. At this altitude, overloaded, she had no maneuvering room. "Missile lock," the co-pilot shouted. "Flares out," Keller yelled, slapping the switch. Bright magnesium streaks shot into the sky, burning hot against the dark. The missile fired. A plume of smoke erupted from the ridge, streaking toward them like a spear. Mitchell dropped the Hawk hard, nose down, skids inches from treetops, rotor wash shredding leaves into a storm. The missile followed, weaving through flares. Come on," she whispered. At the last moment she banked the Hawk left, pulling into a turn so tight the overloaded fuselage groaned. The missile lunged for the heat signature, clipped a flare, and detonated harmlessly in the distance. The shockwave buffeted them, rattling teeth, throwing paratroopers against bulkheads. But they were still flying. Alive. Clawing home. The rest of the flight was a blur of pain and endurance. Mitchell's arms ached from fighting the controls. Her eyes burned from smoke and sweat. Warning lights still flashed, reminding her with every second that the Hawk was bleeding out strength. But mile by mile, the mountains fell behind. At last, the outline of OB Salerno appeared, a rectangle of concrete and steel in the dust, antennas stabbing skyward, medical crews already racing to the pad. Mitchell keyed the radio. Her voice was flat, exhausted, but steady. 2-4 inbound, 250 aboard, all alive. The net went silent. Then, like a floodgate, voices erupted. Disbelief, cheers, reports moving down the chain of command faster than anyone could record them. Say again, 2-4, confirmed, 250 accounted for, 0 left behind. Even the tower's voice cracked. Roger that, 2-4, pad is yours. Bring them home. The landing. The Black Hawk limped toward the pad, hydraulics whining, tail dragging slightly askew. Mitchell coaxed it down, hands trembling now that the fight was over. The skids kissed concrete. The engines wound down, rotors slowing to a weary stop. For a moment, no one moved. Then the doors opened. The paratroopers poured out, not in silence, but in gasps, groans, and the raw noise of men who had survived the impossible. Medics rushed forward, guiding the wounded, shouting for litters. And then something happened Mitchell hadn't expected. The line crew, the mechanics, the cooks, the clerks, soldiers who had stood on the edge of the pad, waiting to count bodies, stood frozen. One by one, they raised their hands in salute. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't ordered. It was raw, unfiltered respect. Mitchell shut down the last of her systems, pulled her helmet off, and sat for a long moment in the cockpit. Her hands finally let go of the cyclic. They shook, violently, the way hands do only after the danger is past. She climbed out slowly, boots hitting the concrete. Keller stood beside her, grease-streaked and pale. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Across the pad, the battalion commander of the 504th stood with his men, still catching his breath, still processing the miracle. He stepped forward, met Mitchell's eyes, and saluted. "Every man accounted for," he said, voice rough. "You gave them back to me." Mitchell returned the salute. Nothing more. Words weren't enough. The climax. That night, the base was alive with stories. Every corner echoed with the same words. She went back. Again and again. Until the last man was out. Some called it reckless. Some called it insane. But to the 250 men who had felt the Black Hawk's rotors thundering over them when all hope was gone, it was something else entirely. It was salvation. And in the silence of her barracks room, Sarah Mitchell sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at her hands. They were raw, still trembling. She thought of the valley, the smoke, the fire. She thought of how close it had been, how thin the margin was between life and death. Then she thought of the faces in the cabin, the salute, the disbelief, the life still burning in eyes that had nearly gone dark. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe. When Mitchell landed at Salerno, the ramp was already crowded. Medics stood ready with stretchers. Officers had clipboards with casualty projections. Mechanics and supply clerks lingered at the edges, silent. Everyone expected a nightmare, a parade of flag-draped stretchers, bloodied uniforms, and the hollow silence of loss. Instead, the Black Hawk's doors opened and soldiers spilled out. They were battered, bruised, burned, and bleeding. Some stumbled with arms over each other's shoulders. Others collapsed into medic arms. A few limped down the ramp, still clutching their rifles with white knuckles. But they were breathing. Every single one of them. The ramp fell silent. Not disbelief, something deeper. Awe. Her commanding officer pushed through the crowd. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard, but there was something beneath the steel. He stopped at the nose of the Black Hawk, staring up at Mitchell as she stepped down from the cockpit. "You disobeyed orders," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Mitchell straightened, helmet tucked under her arm. Her voice was steady. "Yes, sir. You also brought home every last man." The silence cracked. Soldiers, mechanics, medics, and clerks raised their hands in salute. Not the sharp, choreographed salute of ceremony. A raw, uncoordinated gesture. Every man and woman on that ramp lifting their hands in respect for the pilot who had refused to turn back. Mitchell stood at attention, the weight of dust and blood on her uniform, and returned the salute. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't glory. It was something quieter, older. Respect. The aftermath. Later came the paperwork. Pages of reports, statements written under fluorescent lights. Questions asked again and again by officers in crisp uniforms who hadn't smelled the valley smoke. Why did you launch against orders? Why did you risk the bird with no escort? Why did you go back 4 times? Mitchell answered each with the same calm voice. Because they were still alive. And because if we waited, they wouldn't be. Her words went into the record. But the record didn't carry the weight of 250 paratroopers walking through the chow hall that night, alive because one pilot refused to let them die. The reprimand came anyway. It always does. She was written up for disobeying direct orders, for reckless risk to aircraft and crew. The paperwork would live in her file like a scar. But so would the other truth, the one that no ink could bury. The entire 2504th knew her name. And in the Army, reputations move faster than memos. The paratroopers return. When the battalion formed up the next day, their commander stood in front of them. His voice carried across the formation. Every single one of you owes your life to a pilot who chose to stand with you when the book said no. Remember that. Then he turned. In front of the entire battalion, he saluted Mitchell. 250 paratroopers snapped their heels together and followed. The sound was thunder on concrete. Mitchell's throat tightened. She returned the salute, eyes straight, hiding the storm in her chest. It wasn't medals. It wasn't parades. It was the one thing that mattered most. The men she saved knew. Lessons written in fire. Weeks later, instructors from aviation units began showing up at Salerno. Some wore patches from Apache squadrons, some from medevac units, some from assault companies. They wanted to hear it firsthand. Mitchell didn't tell the story for glory. She told it for survival. She broke it down in the language only pilots use: altitude management in valley ambush zones, load calculations when airframes exceed spec, suppression by maneuver with door guns, flare deployment under saturation fire. Her notes were clean, methodical, stripped of theater. She showed the ugly parts too, where a single hit could have ended them, where luck had been as important as skill. Other pilots listened. They asked questions. They took notes. Doctrine shifted, not with fanfare, but by inches. Minimum altitudes in ambush zones were no longer ironclad. Rotorcraft training syllabi added modules about calculated disobedience when survival required adaptation, not blind compliance. And in one binder on a shelf in Fort Ruckers Aviation School, her actions became case study material. Not about heroics, about preparation, judgment, and the courage to choose. Recognition and reprimand. Months passed. Award citations trickled down. Mitchell was given a medal, understated, the wording cautious, extraordinary valor in support of ground forces. It didn't capture the reality. It never could. Her reprimand sat in the same file. Officially, her career should have slowed. But unofficially, commanders sought her out. She was invited to speak to new pilots, to visiting officers, to units about to deploy. Her company commander found her one night by the flight line. He stood awkwardly, hands in pockets. The same man who had told her, "That's final," now searched for words. "I saw risk," he admitted. "You saw preparation. I was wrong." Mitchell shook her head. "I was out of lane. That's on me." "Maybe," he said. "But sometimes the lanes are wrong. Maybe you just showed us where they should have been." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was respect. The memory. In quiet moments, Mitchell thought about the valley. The smoke, the tracer fire, the way the bird had shuddered under her hands like a wounded animal. She thought about how close it had been, how thin the margin was between 250 alive and 250 dead. She never let herself believe it was destiny. It was math, preparation, luck, and men on the ground who refused to break. But sometimes, when she walked the flight line at dawn, she'd pass soldiers from the 504th. They would nod, or stop, or offer a quiet salute. Some said nothing, just touched the Black Hawk's fuselage with the reverence of men touching a relic. Those moments mattered more than ribbons or reprimands. Because they knew. The moral Sarah Mitchell was never the loudest in a room. She never demanded recognition. She didn't hang medals on her wall. She kept her helmet clean, her flight log exact, and her voice steady. But every pilot who heard her story understood the lesson. That careful isn't weakness. Careful is preparation. Careful is knowing the ridgelines by memory, the crosswinds by feel, the ambush alleys by heart. Careful is courage measured down to inches of rotor clearance, seconds of survival, and decisions made in silence while others argued doctrine. And when 250 paratroopers were cut off in a valley that should have been their grave, careful was the reason they walked out alive. And that's the heart of this story. Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell proved that courage isn't reckless. It's the refusal to abandon your brothers when the world tells you to stand down. On that day in Coast, 250 paratroopers were written off. Command expected a casualty list. The enemy expected a massacre. Instead, one Black Hawk pilot drew her own line in fire and carved a way home. Every man survived because she chose to fly forward when everyone else said, "Turn back." If this story gave you chills, salute in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our Army family standing proud across the world. And don't forget, subscribe for more true military stories of valor, sacrifice, and the heroes who refuse to quit. Your support helps keep these voices alive. Until next time, stay strong, stay proud, and never forget those who serve.